Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest Cotswold Archaeology webinar. My name's Neil Holbrook. I'm Chief Executive of Cotswold Archaeology, and I'm going to be the host for this evening. So, tonight's lecture is entitled "The Tale of Unexpected: The Discovery of a Roman Villa in Bristol's northern suburbs." And this is going to be presented by two of my colleagues, Marino Cardelli and Tom Brindle. My relationship with this site is an interesting one, actually, because people often ask me, what is your favorite excavation? And I have to say, I've always had a really soft spot for this dig, because I was there I saw early on when we were doing some of the very early investigations, and I was a regular visitor as the true scale of what we found became apparent, and that was excellent. It was such an exciting story, and we were there excavating. Started off excavating in the summer, finished on Christmas Eve, and that's something I'll remember. So in tonight's webinar, we're going to touch on both the discoveries and also some of the bigger questions, like, what is a Roman villa? Is it a country house? Is it a farm? Is it an estate centre? Or is it even some form of commune? Hopefully we'll be enlightened by the end. Lastly, I just want to really introduce my two colleagues who are going to do all the speaking tonight. First up is Marino Cardelli, Project Officer with Cotswold. Marino's led numerous excavations on significant Roman sites, including the Roman Villa, which we keep calling Dings. You'll find this word Dings being used throughout tonight, and Marino will explain where this word Dings comes from. And secondly, he'll be followed by my colleague Tom Brindle, Principal Post-Excavation Manager in our Milton Keynes office. And Tom's managed the post-excavation analysis and publication of the site, and was one of the principal authors of the resultant books. So it just leaves me really to say we're very grateful to our clients, Barrett Redrow Homes, who funded it, and also to their consultants, RPS Group. And lastly, just to say that during tonight's presentation, there will be some human remains on show, so be aware of that. So for now, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Marino.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you, Tom, for helping me tonight with my presentation. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start my presentation with this picture, because I want you to imagine yourselves standing on a rugby pitch for a second, and not just any pitch, but the one you've played on for years, the one you've been tackling, clashing, and the one you scrape your knees on and maybe even had a questionable pint after the game. So you know the turf, you feel the grass beneath your boots, and it feels solid and feels familiar. Next, please, Tom. But what if I told you that just 30 centimeters below that grass it lies an entire different world, a place where people used to live, used to work, farm, and basically they build their lives. And let's be honest, probably also complaining about the British weather. Now let's picture that for a moment. And I can't see your faces, but if you look surprised right now, that's exactly how I felt at the time. Next, please. My name is Marino Cardelli. I'm a project officer for Cotswold Archaeology, and the one to the right with the classic supervisor pointy finger pose, which is an essential move if you want to survive in this industry. I'd like to say hi and thank you to Sarah, my colleague, who was with me there as a supervisor. She's watching tonight too. And I had the privilege and the absolute shock of being part of both the evaluation phase and the main phase of excavation on a land once associated with the Dings Crusaders Rugby Football Club in Stoke Gifford, South Gloucestershire. Next, please. So between 2016 and 2018, Cotswold Archaeology undertook extensive excavation in the area for Red Row homes, now Barrett Red Row. Before the excavation, the site underwent both a desk-based assessment, a DBA, and a geophysical survey, which are standard archaeological pre-checks to assess its potential. Now, very briefly, the DBA is like the detective work before the dig. It's the first step into understanding a site before anyone puts a trowel into the ground. And then it involves historical research, so looking at old maps, documents, and records, aerial photos, and previous excavation. So basically checking if anyone else has dug nearby and what they found. It tells us if archaeological remains are likely to be present, and also what type of features or structures might exist. The geophysical survey is like giving the ground an X-ray. It helps us to see what's beneath the surface without digging, but basically tells us the layout of buried features. Now, a little bit of reality check. What happened at Stoke Gifford? So basically the DBA said that the site had some archaeological potential, but nothing spectacular. And the geophysics didn't show much. Of course, a few anomalies here and there, nothing to get too excited about. So naturally, we expected a modest discovery, maybe a few ditches, some scattered pottery, a couple of post holes if you're lucky. Next, please. But then, as we pulled the first trenches, things started to get weird. So some features began to appear that didn't match what the survey had suggested, to the point that you almost start questioning yourself, like, am I digging in the right spot here? Because none of it makes sense. And because, let's be honest, no one expected an entire Roman villa beneath a rugby pitch. Not even me, and I'm Italian, as you can tell by my accent. You'd think, of course, you're Italian, you're used to this kind of things, so you shouldn't be surprised. But yeah, but Roman, I wasn't ready for the whole real estate package. Anyway, next, please. A few more trenches were opened, revealing what we scientifically called a lot of stones, because we weren't sure what we were looking at. Was it just rubble? Was it just debris? And then some structures and walls started to emerge, and some alignment made sense. And before we knew it, we were basically mapping out rooms. Next, Tom, please. And at that point, the site went from, oh, this could be interesting, to, oh, okay, we might have a Roman villa underneath a rugby pitch. The excavation process at Stoke Gifford started with the removal of topsoil, exposing the uppermost archaeological horizon. And we soon realized that much of the site was covered with demolition rubble. So to make sense of the mess, we excavated like 30, I think, test pits, each measuring 2 by 2 meters, to figure out how deep the rubble went, and whether we could bring machines to dig it out, or decide to go with an excavation. And next, please. What we found was incredible. And again, Tom, sorry, next one. So we were looking at structural remains, revealing a possible villa complex, trackways, ditches, drains, and pits and postholes, suggesting agricultural or industrial activity. So once we had hand excavated and cleaned and recorded everything, every key areas, we reduced them down to the natural substrate, and this process revealed something even older, pushing the site's occupation further back than we anticipated. Next, please. So basically, long before the Roman villa was built, Dings was home to a modest enclosed farmstead, likely established around the time of Roman conquest of Britain. So we're talking about AD 43, or possibly even earlier. So as you can see there, a single round house was defined by two penannular ditches and stood in the middle of a settlement with a curvilinear enclosure defining the space. The internal ditch, the small one, likely held vertical split timbers to form the walls. And the outer ditch functioned as a drip gully, collecting rainwater, basically. Evidence of a very practical design. The house had a west-facing entrance opening into the enclosure, perhaps for shelter from the winds. And the internal diameter was around 6.8 meters. Very modest, but well constructed. And next, please, Tom. By the 2nd century AD, the settlement underwent a major transformation. So a new system of fields and trackways was introduced, arranged in a more regular and rectilinear pattern, as you can see. This wasn't a complete erasure of the past, but in fact, the curvilinear ditch was sort of reshaped, straightened, and incorporated into the new layout. This reorganization might have been practical, basically making easy to survey for taxation or just to reflect a growing desire to align with the Roman norms and legislations. Next, please, Tom. The roundhouse was rebuilt, let's say upgraded, in the exact same location, now with an east-facing entrance instead of west, and the roof was larger, was about 9.5 meters in diameter. This required a central ring of postles for structural support, and a series of drainage channels were introduced, improving the management of the water runoff. And as a step towards the villa, a timber building with at least 2 rooms was identified by its beam slots. It was constructed possibly at the same time when the roundhouse was rebuilt, and it was 10 meters long by 4 meters wide, but most of it was lost because of the later villa construction. The function remains unclear, but its location, right where the villa would later stand, suggests it played a key role in the transition. Next, please, Tom. The mid to late 3rd century was the turning point at Dings. So the old enclosures were backfilled and leveled, making way for something new. A building with masonry foundations, marking the beginning of what would evolve into a Roman villa. So as you can see, a rectangular masonry building replaced the earlier timber structure. A cottage type house. It measured 18 meters long by 5.5 meters wide, with 4 rooms and a narrow passage running front to back. There was no evidence of a staircase, suggesting that it was a single-story structure. The entrance hasn't been identified, but later developments suggest it likely opened onto a courtyard to the west. This was not yet a grand villa, but it was a significant step in that direction. To the northwest, of the main building, a second masonry structure was constructed, and it was aligned almost perpendicularly to the main one. It appeared to be a single large room, although evidence of curbing suggests it might have been internally divided, and the function again remains uncertain, but we found lots of stone-lined pits and drainage features, so it suggests some sort of industrial or craft activity, but I'm sure Tom will go more in detail about the possible uses. Next, please. And also around the same time as these first masonry buildings, a new trackway was constructed, providing a southern access into the settlement. It had a metal surface and flanking ditches to manage the water so that the surface remained as clear as possible, indicating possibly that it was designed for transport, like carts or carriages. Next one, please, Dom. And finally, we have a villa. By the mid to late 4th century AD, the settlement at Dings underwent its most dramatic transformation yet. So the once simple stone house was expanded, let's say refined, and yes, fully Romanized, marking the moment when Dings could truly be called villa. This was a statement of status, but yeah, a home designed, let's say, for comfort, but at the same time for display, although it's still not among the grandest villas in Britain. What happened was that the original rectangular house was expanded, adding north and south wings, portico at the front, leading into a walled courtyard. Ancillary buildings flanked the courtyard, forming a former villa complex. And the southern wing featured a hypocaust heated room, whilst the northern wing featured a small bath suite. These improvements show that the owners were investing in comfort and status, but the complex was still a working estate. This was not just a home, but it was an agricultural hub, producing surplus goods and connecting to local and regional trade networks. The ancillary buildings likely played a role in processing crops. The one on the bottom left-hand corner contained corn dryers, confirming that possibly cereal processing on site was a thing. Next, please, Tom. Tucked away in the rear range of the villa, 2 rooms, originally separate but later merged into a larger space, possibly for storage, provide an interesting insight into how spaces within the villa were modified and repurposed over time. Like same thing we do with our houses nowadays. So we need a bigger space, we knock down a wall, and in this case the wall was knocked down and the new floor went on top of the foundations of the previous one. Next one, please, Tom. Moving to the north wing of the villa, this room provides some of the clearest evidence of food preparation at Dings. We're still by the mid to late 4th century AD. This wing was subdivided into 3 rooms, one of which was used as a kitchen. The kitchen floor survived pretty well, consisting of large sandstone slabs still intact beneath the very rich charcoal layer material we had to take down to find the floor. And as you can see, there is a rectangular shaped hearth. It was built directly into the floor. It measured approximately 1 meter 10 by 85 centimeters. It was built from sandstone slabs. It had pitch stone sides, forming a durable, let's say, heat-resistant cooking surface. And directly behind it, attached to the southern wall, which was robbed out as most of this area of site, were the remains of an oven. So the sides and the base of the oven were clearly heat affected, showing that this wasn't just a simple open fire, but it was properly constructed for baking or roasting. The oven had a fire pit to the north where the fuel was burned, and a flue directing the heat into the oven, and a baking chamber which was attached to the wall. The floor was made of sandstone slabs, many of which had been scorched. So it's a clear evidence that this was a well-used cooking space. Next, please. And one of the most intriguing rooms in the villa was located at the western extent of the north wing. As you can see, there is a sort of curved upside wall, and in the next one, Tom, probably it's better to show that one. You can see subfloor, some sort of subfloor heating system. So, and we thought this could have been a bath suite. So, what makes a bath suite? So, the upside shape, of course, is typical. It's a typical feature of Roman bath architecture, often seen in hot rooms or steam rooms. And as I mentioned, the subfloor channels, so these narrow ducts running beneath the floor, are kind of consistent with channel hypocaust system, providing underfloor heating. And water-resistant mortar. We found remnants of heavy-duty plaster and waterproof mortar in this area, a clear indicator of bath-related infrastructure, and also associated drainage features. So a series of drains leading out the room to control the water, typical of Roman bathhouses. And next one, please, Tom. Another of the most fascinating discoveries was a stone-lined sunken cistern in one of the ancillary buildings to the northwest. It was built from squared limestone blocks with a rubble core and sand-bonded mortar. The base, as you can see, was left open to the clay, possibly allowing for natural filtration. Some slots in the walls may have supported a wooden cover, and it might have been filled by a pipe from a well or a nearby drain. As you can see from the picture to the right, this is exactly how cistern looked in Roman times. In fact, after a day of pouring rain, even the drains and the wells and things start working again. It's fascinating, but also it's a reminder of how just crucial is water management, because if Roman plumbing is still working better than some modern systems, maybe they were onto something. What was it used for? The exact function is uncertain, but again, I'm sure Tom will be able to tell you more about the results of the sampling. Next, please. And then a little bit of luxury and innovation. If there's one thing that Romans knew how to do well, other than plumbing, it was making their homes warm and comfy, which was a pretty important feature when you're dealing with the British weather. Dings, they took heating very seriously, installing 2 different hypocaust systems, because why settle for one if you can have options? The channeled hypocaust, dating mid-4th century AD, was the first underfloor heating system installed at Dings, and it was pretty high-tech for the time. It was a system of subterranean channels beneath the floor to circulate warm air, and a furnace outside the villa provided the heat directly through these channels. Top right picture, as you can see, a central deflector pillar, what it's called, which helped distribute the heat more evenly. And then bottom right, you can see a stacked hypocaust. This time, next please, Tom. Instead of channels, they used stuck pile, so small square tile columns to create space for hot air to circulate. Pile system provide more intense heat, suggesting this room needed to be particularly warm. Maybe it was a private bedroom or a study or another reception space. We haven't found any separate furnace for this one, so it's possible that this room was somehow connected to the existing heating system, so sharing heat from the earlier hypocaust. Having two types of underfloor heating suggests that the owners were sort of adapting to their needs over time, or that they just really hated to be cold. And last slide, please, Tom. So what's the big takeaway from all of this? What have we learned? Well, if there's one thing the Dings Villa story proves, is that you should never underestimate what's beneath a rugby pitch. And with this, I'll hand over to Tom, who's going to dig even deeper. The pun is fully intended. And so thank you very much. And over to you, Tom.
Okay, thank you very much, Marino. That was a great explanation of what happened in the field. And I suppose I wanted to start really by, I'm going to take a slightly different look at things to Marino. Marino's really summed up what we saw during the field work and how surprising it was and how romantic it was. What we recognized when the villa was revealed was what an amazing opportunity this was, as well as just being this amazing site which was just incredibly well preserved. You don't often get a chance to excavate a villa. They don't turn up very often. Where villas are known, they're often scheduled monuments, which are sort of legally protected sites, and the ones that have been excavated have often been excavated in the Victorian period, or maybe in the earlier 20th century, when techniques were completely different to how we excavate sites now. Often antiquarians would sort of expose the ground plan of the villa to sort of try and work out what the site looked like, what the different rooms might have been used for, but often they wouldn't really sort of drill down into the site. So this was really an opportunity for us to understand not just how the villa might have looked like at the very end of its life, as we've shown on the cover of our book, which I'll come to a little bit later, but also, you know, that development of the site over time, which Marino has already touched on. And I also want to talk about what we do after the fieldwork is finished. So after everyone in the field has revealed these amazing things, what do we do afterwards to transform what we revealed about that site to the story of the site that we present in a book? And I will just warn you, the next slide does show some human remains. Now, Marino really did capture, I think, that excitement of archaeological fieldwork, you know, that sense of not quite knowing what you could discover next, you know, and that really captures a lot of what the romantic side of archaeology is. But when you're looking at a site like Dings, obviously a lot of what you actually learn and understand about the site and what contributes to the story is what you do afterwards. It's what you do after the fieldwork has been completed. And in this case, actually, during and after the houses were being constructed and had been built, we were still sort of working on this post-excavation analysis. So during post-excavation, it's this sort of period where we just draw together all of this information that we've collected during the field work, along with the really carefully put together records that have been compiled by the fieldwork team to piece together the site. So Marino referred to the earlier stages of doing the desk-based assessment as detective work. Well, it is, but so is this once the excavation is finished. You're sort of piecing together the puzzles, but the pieces of the puzzle, putting them together. So we have a whole team of people involved in the post-excavation process after the field work is finished. Now, the first point to make about this is that Dings produced a hell of a lot of finds, absolutely loads. This slide just shows you some of the range of the objects that were found. I'm going to return to some of these objects a little bit later. But we had nearly 10,000 sherds of pottery, for instance. We had over 1,800 metal objects. We had, aside from the artifacts themselves, we had hundreds of animal bones. We took over 60 environmental samples to capture things like wood charcoal, plant remains to inform us about the sort of ancient environment and the sorts of foods that people were using. So we had a huge amount of material to get through. Villa sites do tend to produce a huge amount of material. Now, for this reason, the post-excavation work requires a whole huge team of specialists, all with their own areas of interest. So we had over 20 different specialists looking at the various different material from the site. So we had several different specialists looking at different types of pottery, specialists in architectural stone, for instance, specialists in archaeobotany, osteology, archaeometallurgy, coins, just a whole range of different types of material being looked at by these people. And some people sometimes say, well, why does it take you so long to produce a book after you've excavated a site? You know, it can't take that long. Well, one of the reasons is that we have all of these different people looking at these different things. They have to sort of fit them into their program. And then we have to bring all this together to start to sort of weave that story about the site. So it's a huge undertaking. So not only do we have the fieldwork staff involved, we always have this sort of line of specialists involved throughout the post-excavation process, often sometimes the work taking, you know, a couple of years or more. Now, as part of this, in terms of sort of getting to understand the site, so Marino talked a bit about that chronology, about that sort of development of the site over time. And the way that we're able to do this is we're able to start sort of recognizing some of these sequences in the field whilst the site is being excavated. But part of what we do in this post-excavation phase after the excavation is finished is we do stratigraphic analysis, where what we do is we take the carefully recorded records, the drawings, the photographs that the field team have put together and recorded, and we begin to sort of pull it apart and try to recognize what the different layers mean, how they, you know, how the different dating evidence fits within the different layers, so we can pull apart that sequence and make sense of it. And you'll see here on the let me just get a oops, I'll skip forward one. You'll see here on the left-hand side, this is a plan, sort of a digitized plan of all of the features that were revealed during the field work. So it looks like a bit of a mess sort of on the screen, but actually by looking at the stratigraphic analysis, by pulling apart the site, looking at the individual contexts that we've recorded, and we recorded nearly 3,500 of them in the field, we can begin to pull apart those sequences. And Marino showed this sort of slide of showing you the early enclosure with the first roundhouse, dating from the 1st century AD. And it's by doing this sort of post-excavation work that we're really able to pull apart these different phases of the site. And the specialist material that we've collected, that's looked at by the various different specialists, enables us to start thinking about what was going on at these different phases. So we'll relate the specialist material to these different phases, dating them via things like pottery evidence, but also things like radiocarbon dating. And the environmental material we discovered from the first phase of the settlement enables us to produce things like these reconstructions. They're never going to be completely accurate, of course, but it allows us something to go on in terms of recreating what the site may have looked like. So what we do know is that during the first phase of the settlement, the site was a small-scale farming settlement. It probably had a mixed mixed economy, with cereal remains recovered from lots of the soil samples that we took, indicating that they were growing spelt and processing spelt wheat at the site. We had weed seeds, which indicated grassland and field margins of arable environments. We also had the remains of a four-poster, a structure that you can see here. And these are normally interpreted as grain stores, so they're raised off the ground to prevent the grain getting damp. The animal bones showed that we had cattle, sheep and goat from this period, and also juvenile pigs, suggesting that they were actually breeding pigs at this time. So they were consuming a range of livestock during this period. Now, we didn't actually have a huge number of artifacts from this period. So we're looking at around probably the mid 1st century AD, as Marino mentioned, probably around the time of the Roman conquest. We're not entirely sure. It may have been a little bit earlier. It may have been a little bit later. But the pottery suggests we're talking around the middle of the 1st century AD. Now, what is actually really interesting, though, although we didn't have many finds that we could clearly date to this particular phase, what we did have were lots of early coins that sort of turned up at other different parts of the site. Not all of them clearly relatable to this phase, but some of them were very early. So we had things like coins of the Emperor Claudius, the Emperor Domitian, and the Emperor Vespasian. And you don't typically get those very early Roman coins at rural sites like this. It's quite unusual to have them. We also had some pottery, some Samian pottery from southern Gaul. And again, you don't tend to get southern Gaulish pottery at these rural sites. This is 1st century pottery that normally you'll get at maybe military sites or towns. So it's odd that we get it here. And it does maybe suggest that even at this early stage, when we're looking at a farmstead, which hasn't got any kind of clear evidence at sort of pretension, it does seem to suggest maybe that it's sort of linked into these wider networks that are emerging with the conquest of Rome. So at the same time that this settlement is emerging, we've also got the establishment of a site at Sea Mills near Bristol, which was an important Roman harbour. Probably had military links. We think it was established by AD 50 to 55, but possibly earlier. And it may well have been associated with sort of military supply, supplying the legionary fortress at Caerleon in Wales. So there is a possibility that some of this very early material that we have at Dings, some of these early coins, this early Roman Samian, actually somehow suggests a link between Dings and this early harbour at Sea Mills. There may well have been an early relationship. Now, Marino's talked about what happened then during the 2nd century. We seem to have had this absolute radical rehaul of the site. So we had this new roundhouse constructed. We had this new series of trackways and rectilinear layout of the site established. Now, this is a sort of pattern we see throughout southern Britain, actually, at this period. Towards the end of the 1st century AD, sort of early 2nd century AD, we often see this reorganization of settlements along these lines. So often you might have sort of late Iron Age settlements, early Roman settlements that are similar to our enclosure, which suddenly have this transformation. It's not clear why this happened, but Marino's hinted at the idea that possibly this is to do with surveying land, being able to actually work out how much people should be paying in tax, that sort of thing. We're not entirely sure, but that's could be what's going on in terms of why we're getting these rectilinear arrangements. And it all seems linked to the increasing networks of small towns we get from this period, the end of the 1st century, early 2nd century, along the Roman road network that was beginning to emerge at this time. And it seems linked with these sort of sites building up agricultural production and sort of sending their produce, their surplus produce to market centres. It all seems linked to that sort of system. Don't pay too much attention to the labels. They're probably quite hard to read here. But what this shows is the huge range of sites we can now recognise in the sort of Bristol area now that have been excavated. Now, not all of these sites are as well known as Dings, but a lot of them were occupied at around the same time. And so you can see that these trackways that we have emerging at Dings at the sort of turn of the 2nd century are potentially linking not just the site to places like Sea Mills, where there may well have been markets, but also to these other sites, all linked through the field systems, through these trackways. So there's all sorts of opportunities now for sort of communication between these different sites, and they all seem to be linked to this sort of wider system. Now, some of these, like Dings, seem to have come on to turn into villas. We'll talk about some of these later. These are shown in blue, if you can see them on here. We'll come back to some of these later. And the green are sort of other rural settlements, potentially farmsteads. But not many of these sites actually turned to develop into villas. Now, what we see at Dings, at around the same time that we suddenly see this emergence of these trackways and this new layout being established, is this huge range of artifacts emerging. So we suddenly see a dramatic increase in numbers of artifacts, but also in terms of the types of artifacts we get. All of a sudden, we're getting much more pottery into the site. We're getting things like amphorae, which suggests import of things like olive oil and perhaps wine as well, and much more in the way of dress accessories. So we had absolutely loads of brooches, for instance, from the site, which are shown here on in this slide. And what this is showing is that the site is much more connected than it has been previously. So possibly, as I mentioned, to the site at Sea Mills, where there may well have been markets, but also to other settlements where people have the opportunity to mingle with other people and present themselves in particular ways. So we're seeing this sort of opportunity for presenting particular ways of dressing with things like finger rings and brooches. So this is all sort of tied in with this new network of opportunities for presenting yourself. Now, as well as things like brooches, we had all sorts of, well, thousands of other objects from the site, which actually give us some sort of insight into the activities that took place. So we have things like spindle whorls, for instance, which indicate spinning was taking place, quite possibly associated with the wool gathered from sheep that we know were being raised at the site from the animal bones that we had there. We had things like whetstones for sharpening tools. And we also had things like quernstones for grinding grain to make flour from wheat grown at the site. Now, this particular example of a quernstone, it might not look particularly like much. We've got about half a quernstone here. The interesting thing about this particular one is that almost all of the stone objects from the site were actually made locally. So they were made out of local stone. They were probably fashioned relatively locally, even if they were imported to the site. But this particular example was actually made of German lava stone. So this was actually manufactured somewhere else and brought to the site. These sorts of objects are really rarely found in Western Britain. Where they are, they seem to be associated with military sites. Sometimes they're associated with major towns. There are some known from Bath. But the only one particularly comparable with this exact example is an example from Sea Mills. So it probably was shipped into the harbour at Sea Mills. And again, this gives you that sort of other link to the settlement at Sea Mills there at Dings. There is even a possible military link between these quernstones, that they seem to have been brought in with the military and then in other parts of the country filtered down to the civilian network, but far less so in Western Britain. So it does raise the question as to whether or not there is some sort of military link with Dings, although it's not an overt association. A lot of the other finds from the site also seem to be relatively mundane objects, but actually they tell us a lot when you actually drill down into them and you think about the other types of objects that are found at other sites. So this object here is fairly obviously, this is an iron lift key. Now, it doesn't sound that exciting, but keys are not especially common finds at low status rural settlements. You don't often get them at sort of lower status farms. And what it implies is that, well, for one, they were presumably valuables at Dings that needed to be kept safe. Now, these could have been resources, so that could have been things like grain, or they could have been personal objects or wealth. So they suggest that sort of level of something that needs to be kept safe. But they perhaps also reflect the size of the population at Dings. The fact that you probably had a family who were farming the land, but also probably lots of other workers who were frequenting the site, working on the site. So you might have had people who perhaps were relatively unknown coming and going. So you might have had reasons to keep things locked up. He might have had various workers and possibly even slaves. The item at the top left here this is an iron mattock head, and again it seems like a fairly mundane object, but again really rare objects. We don't often get the survival of these sorts of agricultural tools, and it was probably used during the cultivation of some of the horticultural plots that we saw at Dings. So just to return to this this image again, some of these field systems that we've got, or perhaps these were being used for horticulture. This might have been the sort of place that we would have seen our mattock being used. Some of them perhaps would have been used for livestock. Now, the environmental evidence shows that we had really good evidence actually for species like hawthorn and blackthorn. And so the environmental specialist was able to suggest, well, maybe some of these trackways were lined and these enclosures were lined with hedges of hawthorn and blackthorn, as is traditionally the case often, which would have been ideal for keeping livestock in some of these enclosures. Now, they probably would have been a bit smaller than this, but we know that we had cattle throughout the periods of occupation at Dings. And what we actually see at Dings is that cattle become proportionately more important throughout. So in the first stage of settlement at Dings in the 1st century AD, sheep and goats seem to be the most important animals in terms of the economy. But as time goes on, cattle become much more of a greater proportion of the animals raised and utilized at Dings. And this is a much wider pattern that we see across southern Britain. This is quite a familiar pattern, and it would seem likely that what we're seeing actually is this increased importance of cattle, quite possibly replacing maybe the mattock as beasts of burden. So we're actually seeing them pulling ploughs as arable production increases. We actually had a cow phalanx bone, which is part of the foot at Dings, which actually showed evidence of wear, which possibly indicates that it was being used, intensive use drawing a plough. So our specialists are able to kind of recognize this sort of pathology on individual bones, which are able to allow us to start sort of putting together how these animals might have been treated. Now, I've looked at some of our mundane finds, but amongst the thousands of objects, we also had some really quite remarkable finds. Now, one of these was this absolutely fantastic, remarkable bronze oil burning lamp. You can see what it does. What it's depicting is a little seated figure. It would have originally had little hands, and it's missing, and it would obviously have once had a head. Now, we don't know who this would have represented. It may well have been holding an object which would have helped us sort of recognize it from mythology as a mythological representation or a deity. We're just not sure. It is similar to some examples that do depict mythological characters. So there are examples known that depict, for example, Silenus, who is the companion of Bacchus, the god of wine and merriment. But we just don't know in this instance. But these sorts of finds are really quite uncommon. We just don't get these sorts of things from rural sites typically. When they are found, they're usually from major urban or military sites. So its discovery at Dings is really quite notable. It almost certainly was an import from the Mediterranean. So it was probably manufactured at one of the specialist workshops that we know of, possibly from somewhere near Naples or Corinth or Alexandria. So this is a really exotic item. Again, this may well have come into the site via the port at Sea Mills. But this is an early object again. These date to the 1st century AD. They don't typically go on much longer than that. So either it may well have been lost early in the history of the settlement, or it was an heirloom object. It was something that was kept and then lost later on in the history of the site. Now, unfortunately, this was a find made by a metal detector. It wasn't recovered from any of the contexts. It had already been disturbed. It had been dragged out of its original context during damage to the site. So we aren't able to sort of tie this into a particular period of the site, but it's a really interesting find. And we had loads and loads and loads of other exciting finds recovered from the site. So including in the top left here, we had this lion-headed mount, which probably adorned some sort of ornate box or a casket, you know, so something which would have held, you know, some important valuables possibly. We also had the remnants of this really intricate copper alloy vessel, which was constructed using a lathe. Really fine, interesting object. Now, we're not sure exactly what this might have been. It could have been something like a cosmetics pot, something for face cream or makeup, or perhaps even more excitingly, possibly something like an ink pot, as displayed in this example, which is in the British Museum collection. Either, to be honest, are quite significant and interesting because neither are that common at sites. Ink pots are particularly rare, especially at rural sites in Britain. They tend to be found at military sites, at towns, where they are found at rural sites. They tend to be found at villas. But it implies, if it is an ink pot, literacy at the site, and by extension, the speaking of Latin. So really, really rare and exciting finds. But I don't want to get too excited. It might just be a cosmetics pot, of course. So now to talk about this question that Neil introduced at the very start of the talk. So I've pinched Marino's slide here, which says finally a villa, but I've added a question mark here. So we say finally a villa. Well, is it a villa? What are we calling a villa? Well, there's no doubt that this site of ours was of high status. We've got the channeled hypercourse, we've got the stacked hypercourse here, we've got a bathhouse. So there's a level of wealth at this site. It's really quite it's not just your typical farm. But we haven't got any evidence for a mosaic. We didn't have any tesserae, anything like that, anything that suggested we had a sort of really kind of intricate decorated mosaic that you do get at some well-adorned sites. Now, you know, a mosaic might be something that, you know, some people would say, well, you know, if it hasn't got a mosaic, is it really a villa? What is it? Is it a farm? So it's useful here, I think, to compare Dings with some other sites which are sometimes termed villas in the surrounding area. So these are displayed on this map, and you can see actually the ground plans of Dings, which is shown here in the top left, with some of these other examples, are actually sort of broadly similar. These are all shown to the same scale. Dings is perhaps slightly smaller than some of the others, but it is broadly comparable. But it is lacking in some of those sort of more luxurious elements. So it is lacking in those mosaics that you can see illustrated here in sort of green in some of these other sites, like Brislington, for example, and like King's Weston. It doesn't have those features. It's got a small bathhouse that Marino explained, sort of in the northwest wing, but it hasn't got a sort of standalone bathhouse that some of these have. And actually, it's very small and unremarkable compared to some of the others. So, you know, where does it sit in terms of this scale of wealth? Well, something that I think contributes to this is some of the other finds that we found. So we actually had some architectural finds. So, for instance, in the top left, we had this remarkable finial that was recovered from the demolition rubble recovered from the site. And it possibly adorned a gateway or one of the elements of the roof of the site. And you can see it's shown here on our reconstruction. We can just about see here; it's quite small. Shown on our reconstruction drawing here. We also had the remnants of a dwarf column, which almost certainly came from the columns associated with the portico at the front of the villa. So, although we didn't have things like a mosaic, and although it's sort of relatively small scale compared to some villas, there is absolutely no doubt that when you were approaching this site as a visitor, it would be intended to really display its wealth. You know, the owners of this site were sort of trying to mark themselves out as people of sort of exceptional status, even if they couldn't go to the extent of having sort of mosaic floors put in. So it sort of almost shows you that there's that sort of almost perhaps superficial level of opulence there. We're not right at the top end of villas, and we can see that, for example, by comparing Dings here, and again, this is to scale, with the super villa, which is known from Chedworth, further north in Gloucestershire in the Cotswolds, which is just of another scale entirely. I mean, these are entirely different institutions. There's no doubt whatsoever, I think, that villa was a working farm estate which had some levels of pretension. Chedworth was something else entirely. So we shouldn't really be necessarily calling these things the same thing. Is Chedworth a villa? Is Dings a villa? They're not the same thing. Now, just before I move on to the next slide, I will just warn you again that it does contain human remains. So I'll give you a moment just to look away if you are sensitive to that sort of thing. Now, just to talk a little bit about the people from Dings, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about the evidence from the human remains that we've had. You can return to the book if you'd like to find out a bit more. But we did have a small group of 5 burials. One of these was a cremation burial, which is shown here in the top left. That was buried within a pottery vessel. And this dated to the late 2nd to early 3rd century. Now, the other 4 burials that we found were all inhumation burials. They were all buried in graves. And like many rural burials at this time, these were slightly later, probably late 3rd to 4th century in date. And these were found sort of buried on the outskirts of the settlement, aligned along the field boundaries. And we often get that sort of pattern at Roman villas, where you get these sort of burials aligned along field boundaries, but not always in major cemeteries, although some sites do have cemeteries. This particular example, you can see some stones here, and this example seemed to have been lined with stones. It may have been a kist burial, which is a very sort of common burial rite in the southwest of Britain in particular. Now, there's nothing really to suggest that these people that we discovered, just a small group that we discovered, were the elite occupants of the villa. It seems more likely, probably, that the elite maybe were buried elsewhere in a cemetery, perhaps, which was more refined, perhaps more defined, and may even have had some sort of structures associated with it. Where these didn't survive amazingly well, these burials, but where the pathology allowed us to identify it, you could see that they had clearly had very hard lives. They'd had lives of wear and tear, So perhaps these burials actually represented the workers on the estate, and possibly even slaves. But the truth is, we don't really know who they were. So just to move on, I'd sort of like to finish by just talking about the end of Dings. So the evidence we've got from pottery and from coins suggests that activity at Dings carried on right through until the very end of the 4th century, up until at least around 400 AD, and probably into the 5th century. So we had just under 300 coins from the site. I won't go into detail here, but this chart shows the coin loss at the site based upon the coins we found. So you'll see that at Dings, which is the black bar here, we see sort of slow coin loss right up until the late 3rd century, and then much higher coin loss in the 4th century. And this is a sort of very common pattern, basically, at sort of all Roman sites. It sort of follows the pattern. Peter Guest reported on these coins in the book that we've published. Now, what is quite interesting at Dings is, as I mentioned, we have coins which go right up to 402 AD. The latest coin we have was minted in at least 395 AD, and so potentially was circulating well into the 5th century. Now, the great thing is, a lot of the coins that we found were unstratified. They were found sometimes mostly with metal detectors, but we had 2 coins which were actually found beneath layers in room T11 and room T10. So beneath the makeup layers before the final construction of these rooms here. And one of these was this coin that dates from 395 AD. So that's fantastic, because it allows us to recognize that these rooms at the rear range of the villa was still being adapted right up until the very end of the 4th century, quite possibly into the 5th century. So it gives us that excellent dating evidence for the villa still being maintained and refurbished. Now, this is really good evidence because often we don't have that evidence for activity quite so late. We do see activity into the 5th century at sites. It's becoming increasingly more common. This is another one, but it's great to actually see that recognised. Where we do see that activity, it does seem to be quite a sort of southwest phenomenon. We get similar sorts of activity at the roadside settlement at Gatcombe, at the other villa nearby at Lyde Green. And we've also had interesting radiocarbon dates recently from the important villa at Chedworth, which I showed a plan of earlier on, which suggest, although you know there is a little bit of controversy here, but they do seem to suggest that mosaics were still being constructed and laid up until the 420s and possibly later. So this is opening up all sorts of discussion about how late these sites went on for. So this is really useful information. Oh, that's just to show where our late coins came from, as I've explained. Now, what happened after the villa? Well, the truth is we don't really know. Now, what's really interesting is that we did have a post-Roman cemetery that was excavated about 20 years ago, 400 meters to the east of the villa at Dings. And this was active at some point. Radiocarbon dates indicate between the early 5th and the mid 7th century or later. We don't know if there's any association between that cemetery and Dings. We really don't know that at all. But what's interesting is that you often do seem to get these post-Roman cemeteries being established near boundaries, near ruined, but still visible in the landscape, villas and sometimes temples. So it is a sort of noted phenomenon. It's something that we do see. The presence of the cemetery, you know, perhaps it indicates, oh, sorry, I've skipped slides. Perhaps it indicates a continuation of the population to some extent. So in the post-Roman period at this point, they could well have been people who had sort of cultural and even perhaps kinship links with the people who had occupied Dings. You know, this cemetery didn't have any of the hallmarks of Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, so they could well have been descendants of the people who occupied Dings. So it's an interesting sort of tantalizing glimpse of people still occupying this area after the abandonment of the villa in the early 5th century. Now I'll leave it there. That's sort of a whistle-stop tour through some of the finds from Dings. If you'd like to know more, please, I'd urge you to read our book, which was published just over a year ago. And you can also delve a bit deeper into some of the elements of the site through the interactive web map that we produced that's linked to the book, and which I think Kaz has put a link in the chat. And I'd finally just to finish by echoing Neil's thanks at the start to Redrow Homes, now Barrett Redrow, who funded the excavation and the post-excavation work and publication. And without them, obviously, we wouldn't have any of this significant work. And of course, to RPS, who acted as archaeological consultants to the site throughout. Thank you very much.
What a great excavation. You know, I've just forgotten how exciting that dig was and how it just kept on delivering week after week. And, you know, it was such a motivating and exciting period for all of us in Cotswold Archaeology, because we knew we had something quite special on that site. And as I said, we started in the summer. I think it was July, August time, school holidays, and we finished on Christmas Eve. And everyone always says archaeology is a race against time. It was a race against water. Groundwater was rising, a very wet autumn, and literally the site was going to disappear underwater from the groundwater. So we did an amazing job. And massive credit to Marino and his colleagues on site, and also then to Tom and his colleagues doing a subsequent analysis. It's clear the talk has really caught people's imagination because it had so many interesting and great questions. So I think we'll do 15 minutes and then call it quits at 8:30, because otherwise, but we could be here for a long time. I'm going to start off with Marino. I'm going to back one to Marino. So, Marino, people have asked you. You use this word context. Can you explain what a context is?
Oh dear. Okay. So we call a context basically all the information, let's put it this way, all the information's associated with an archaeological element, such as, let's say we're talking about a ditch. A ditch comprises a construction cut, let's call it like that, and a backfill. So the information related to this element would be where it is in the space, what orientation, what contains, what finds, what relationship has with everything else. And basically we try to wrap around and explain that context, that element, and merge it into the grand picture, basically. Sorry if I couldn't explain better than that, but yeah.
No, it's a sort of bit of jargon that we tend to use as archaeologists, and I mean, we're also just amazing looking at where the questions are coming in from: Slovenia, Southern California, Belgium. Amazing interest in what we've got here. I'm going to ask a question, personal question, I think, for Marino, from a certain Sarah Jane. I think formerly of our parish, I suspect.
Yeah.
And I think we may have seen a picture of her digging on the side. What was your favourite experience on the excavation?
Other than working with Sarah, well, I think everything was a great experience on site. In terms of discovery, obviously, this was big. What I found really fascinating is such a small thing, but you've seen the hypocross system. You've seen the furnace outside. When we found that, I felt really, really pleased with myself, because I was convinced by looking at the color of the ground and that. And I said to myself, this is where the furnace is. This is where the furnace is. And when I finally found it, I felt so happy and satisfied. I don't know how to explain it, but when you key things together, you put the puzzle together and everything works. It's amazing.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember it is it's that process on site of realizing that one thing ties in with another thing, and that makes something, and you begin to that exciting moment when you think, actually, I get it. You know, I kind of get what it is we've got. I'm going to go to Tom for this next one, and quite a lot of people are. First of all, they want to know, why did we dig here in the first place? I mean, why on earth did we just choose to dig underneath a rugby pitch in Bristol? And perhaps related to that, people are surprised that the geophysics didn't show the villa. Can you perhaps put a bit of colour on that, Tom?
Yeah. Well, why did we dig? Well, the way that archaeology works in Britain is that most archaeological excavations happen sort of ahead of development. So ahead of things like housing construction, road development, railway development, things like that. And so in the UK, when a proposal for a development is put forward, the developer will normally need to explore whether or not archaeology is likely to be affected, and part of that will be to get a company to undertake a desk-based assessment, as Marino said, which may indicate that something is likely to be there, and which then needs investigating, which then took place through the evaluation and the subsequent excavation. So that is the reason. I mean, so the result of the desk-based assessment raised suggestions that something may well be there, because, you know, Bristol is a very historic place. We know that there is a lot of Roman archaeology in the area, as I showed in some of those plans. There are a lot of settlements known from the area. So it's not a crazy idea to think that there may have been something either prehistoric or Roman or later there. And so that's exactly why we do these sorts of desk-based assessments and evaluations. As for why the geophysics didn't show this remarkable villa, well, sometimes it doesn't work. You know, sometimes it's down to the geology. You know, often you have remarkable results from geophysics, which basically reveal the layout of sites fantastically well. And in some cases, the geology is just not susceptible to producing good geophysical survey results. Had it in this case, maybe it would have been a different story, I suppose. You know, maybe we wouldn't have had the opportunity to excavate and tell this remarkable story about this villa, because maybe a different approach may have been taken. Not entirely sure. But that those are the reasons. I hope that explains it.
I'm going to ask a really tough question. I'm going to ask it to Tom and then to Marino. So you can same question, and you can perhaps people. Why here? Why? What was it about that site that lent itself to being the site of a Roman villa rather than the field next door or somewhere else? What was it? And you know, Tom can talk about it from his knowledge of the Roman Empire. Marino spent 5 or 6 months at that site, so he probably's got a very sort of personal connection with the locality. Can you come up with why you think that particular spot was chosen?
Who's going first?
You go first.
Well, I think when you look at the topography, it just sort of drops down slightly to a sort of brook. You've got a sort of nice vista dropping down to the brook. You can see why it would have made an attractive settlement in the first place, I think, during the Iron Age. But then, you know, I suppose that raises the question: why was it not selected even earlier? You know, earlier than the late Iron Age or the mid first century, whenever it was first established. So, I mean, that's a good question. And I guess the thing is, we often just don't see there must have been many similar sites to Dings that we just don't see because they have been wiped out. You know, they've been wiped out by, you know, modern development and things like that, or, you know, things that have happened in the 19th, 20th century, you know, with the development of places like Bristol, where we wouldn't have had things in place to recognize them. Now we have a few villas known from the Bristol area, but I wonder how many we're missing. So how many others would there have been in similarly favorable spots? Not sure, but yeah, I think there was something about the topography and that sort of lay of the land, which allowed it to, you know, perhaps was favorable as well for in terms of agriculture, which allowed it to produce that surplus, which allowed it to flourish, you know, and become wealthy.
Marino, what's your
I think it's the same for me. Topography plays a big role in that, and also we forgot to mention what I did, but we found 3 wells on site. So for me, a source of water is very important. If you can't find water on the land, you can't grow crops, you can't feed animals, you can't survive. So I think that would have been another reason why people settled there. And for generations, I like to think that the same people who owned the roundhouses, you know, they're relative to the one that owned the villa at the end. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. I mean, it's a tough question. It's a great question because it actually makes you really think. And that question of why here is always a hard one to answer. We're going to stick with a sort of watery theme with Marino, and people are interested in the system.
Yeah.
And they kind of want to know what the system was doing. What do you think that system was for? Why were they collecting water and what were they doing with it?
So the cistern was found in one of the ancillary buildings, so far away from the main house. So my suggestion would be something to do with crops, maybe, sorry, with crafts. I personally, I'll tell you what I think, Neil. I personally like to think that that was used for washing stuff, as in even colouring fabrics, some sort of mini Fulonica, if you like. We haven't found evidence of that at all, but I'd like to think that people used to color their clothes and maybe sell them somewhere else. I think I read the question. It's not for to bring the water into the villa, because as I said earlier, we found a couple of wells to the northern side, so that was the source of water that fed the house. This was for industrial activities. So I don't know the answer.
Okay, I'm gonna punt one to Tom. And these are all hard questions, so there's no easy question tonight. So everyone's got to stay awake and on the ball. How many people? What sort of magnitude, what number of people might have lived at Dings, do you think, in the Roman villa phase?
Well, the truth is, we really don't know. I think probably we're looking at, maybe an extended family associated with the main house. As I said, we only had the 5 burials. So which clearly, when you're talking about sort of around 400 years of occupation, is not enough. We've got a very small proportion of the people who ever lived and worked at Dings, but also we don't know where other people may have lived. So you could imagine that there must have been a lot of workers associated with the site who probably didn't necessarily live in those main buildings. As Marino explained, the ancillary buildings don't seem to have been domestic residences as far as we can tell. They seem to have been for industry or agricultural processing. So there may well have been other buildings associated with the estate where that might have housed workers, maybe even slaves. We don't know about the we don't know about the sort of social structure. But my guess, and it is a guess, is perhaps an extended family associated with the villa, and then some additional buildings. I don't know, maybe 20 workers or something like that. But then you could have imagined, of course, that the work would also quite often be seasonal. You would imagine. So you might have people sort of being drawn in at different times of the year from different farming settlements. We don't really understand the link. Was Dings an estate centre that had control over other farmsteads in the area, and therefore could bring in tenants to work at certain times of the year? We don't know is the answer, but I mean, it's often thought that the larger villas would have been sort of estate centres and would have had, there would have been a hierarchical structure, and they would have had sort of other settlements that sat, underneath that sort of structure. And the truth is, we just don't know at Dings.
And a really sort of great question from Eleanor, who's 16 years old and lives in Wisconsin. Is there any evidence of children?
No, well, no, not at Dings. No. You do get evidence from many sites. I mean, sadly, you often get child burials at rural settlements, especially villas. And sometimes actually there's evidence to show that children were sometimes treated slightly differently and placed in slightly different areas, sometimes associated with the building itself, while other burials were placed elsewhere around the settlement. But actually, in Roman archaeology generally, it is quite difficult to recognize, evidence for children. You don't often find things that are easily interpreted as toys, things like that. You do get sort of miniature objects and things, but often they're typically associated as being, votive or ritual objects, as opposed to things like toys. That sort of thing is really rare. So it is really, really difficult to recognize children unless you have their burials. You know, it's a hard thing to do.
Okay, we have two more questions, and then one from Marino, and this is nothing to do with archaeology. Everyone's fascinated by why we keep calling this villa Dings. They keep saying, what is Dings? What does Dings mean?
So Dings, it still is, I think, a great football club. Sorry, rugby club. So it's Dings Crusaders. If you want to Google it, they've got a new pitch, because this one obviously it's gone. I don't know what division they play, but
They're good.
They're good. They're good. So yeah, that's why we call it Dings, and also because all of our paperwork started with this site code that said Dings. So for us, that has always been Dings.
Well, Tom, can you tell us about the origin of Dings? What does because Dings isn't really where we, you know, there's a sort of story, isn't there, behind Dings?
You have to tell. I can vaguely remember it, Neil, but it's a long time since we wrote.
Well,
the book,
there you go. Dings was a slum in the centre of Bristol, and Dings Crusaders were Christian, not quite sort of missionaries, but I guess sort of Victorian do-gooders in that kind of sense. And they went into the slums to try and improve the working lifestyle of people living on the poverty line in central Bristol. And one of the things they really believed in was physical exercise and sport. And so I think they established a rugby team. And these people who used to go around the suburb, the hovels and the depressed area, but were called the Dings Crusaders. And so that's where the name of the rugby club comes from. So look it up on Google, Dings. It's not where we dug. It's in the centre of Bristol, but I think the people went and played rugby on the outskirts. So there we are. Okay, and then a last one. Is it the same people, do we think, all the time, from the roundhouse into the villa? Or is it different people? Are some Celts, indigenous Brits, Roman incomers? What do we think? Can we guess?
Well, there's a hint, I think, that between the first and the second phases, where you see the reconstruction of the roundhouse in the same spot. So you see it reorientated, but you see the reconstruction exactly the same spot. And you see, even though you've got that reorganization, you get that sort of linear arrangement and the trackways, they're basically sort of tidying up the earlier enclosure. It's not an eradication of what went before at that stage, you know, in the early 2nd century. So that suggests, I think, at least at that stage, you're looking at some level of continuity, that they're basically been asked to, you know, adhere to these new rules that have been brought in, but it is effectively the same family. And then there is, you know, at that period, we also seem to have this new shift towards the area which later became the sort of main building, with that first timber building, and again, that seems to be the area that then retains that focus throughout the next 250, 300 years. So because we don't have any clear just eradication or clear kind of it's piecemeal, you know, it's piecemeal development. It almost feels like it's, you know, generations adding to as the wealth is accumulated, as the family's fortunes have increased, that they're investing more of that sort of family wealth in the settlement. Now, and we simply don't know. But because you don't see that clear eradication of anything that's gone before, there is almost maybe, you know, a temptation perhaps to see it as the same people kind of from beginning to end. But, you know, no doubt, you know, in a period of 400 years with people moving around, you know, what you've got you've got to appreciate is that it's a really dynamic period. You know, you've got people moving around. You've got Sea Mills, which is just down the road, which is an important harbour. You've got people moving around all over the place. So in terms of sort of, you know, ethnicity or, you know, I wouldn't be seeing the people as exactly the same at 400 AD as they were in 50 AD. I think things would have changed fairly dramatically, even if there was sort of direct passing on of the estate, you know, via family ties. But the truth is, I don't think we can really say.
Well, sounds like you're earing more towards Brits, which is a shame, because on site everyone was kept saying this was Marino's ancestors who lived in this house, and so Marino might have been the first Italian to set foot at Dings. Who knows?
Like, what I think, Neil, very, very briefly, is that, let's say the hypocrust system, all right, if you want that thing in your house, you must have seen it somewhere else. And it's that thing, that link that we miss. So if I visit your house and I see a beautiful bathroom, I say, oh, I'd like that for my house. And that's how it works. So it's that link that we miss. Where are they from? Where are they coming from? Who they visited? Are they Roman? Are they local? Roman wannabe? We don't know.
Well, we're going to call it a day there. So many questions. I haven't had over 70 questions, which is just extraordinary. And such great feedback. So really, Marino and Tom, thank you so much. That was such a excellent, insightful, interesting, and also, you know, passionate. You obviously both feel very deeply about this site, and that came through very clearly. To everyone listening in, thank you so much for your time and attention this evening. So great to have such an audience from all over the world. Never ceases to blow me away where people are listening to us about. As you log out, please take a couple of minutes to do the survey, and there will be a reading list issued as well. And so from all of us in the Cotswolds and parts surrounding, thank you for your time tonight, and we'll see you again for another webinar in the not too distant future. So thank you and good night.
Thank you.